This is Laurie Hall, author of An Affair of the Mind and host of the website www.afteranaffairofthemind.com. And we're here today for part 2 of a discussion with Dr. Barbara Steffens, co-author with Marcia Means of the book Your Sexually Addicted Spouse, How Partners Can Cope and Heal. Yesterday we talked about this, why relational trauma affects spouses of sex addicts so profoundly, and we're just really delighted to welcome Barbara back. Barb.
Hi.
When we were talking yesterday, we were talking about the severe symptoms that spouses of sex addicts experience, and these are profound relational trauma symptoms such as not being able to read, intrusive dreams, panic attacks, if you will, and they've suffered largely in silence about that. And I'm wondering if you can tell us, is this all just in our heads, or is there a physiological aspect to this too?
It's absolutely not in our heads. Well, it kind of is in your head because it's in your brain, and that's in your head. But it is. We're learning more and more about the neurological responses to trauma, the physiological responses to trauma, not just emotional response. It's a full body response. So no, it's not just in your head like it's imaginary, or if you were just a stronger person. Extremely strong people are susceptible to trauma. Trauma can happen to anyone, anytime, any place. And the body has this way of reacting to potential threat. And so when you're feeling all those crazy feelings and the behaviors that come with that, that's the body's response to the trauma.
Okay, thank you. In your book, your Sexually Addicted Spouse, How You Can Cope and Heal, you write that your research showed that 70% of the women you surveyed met the symptomatic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Would you please tell us what PTSD is and what's the relationship between relationship trauma and PTSD?
Okay. Post-traumatic stress disorder is usually understood as a collection of emotional and behavioral physiological responses to a traumatic event. And people who do diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder are very specific on what kind of events can be considered traumatic. And in general, we think of them as either life-threatening or potentially life-threatening, or that we witness something that's life-threatening to someone else. And how it relates to betrayal trauma or trauma in partners is that the trauma of finding out the discovery of the sex addiction, plus some of the other things that are happening in a relationship with an active addict, are traumatic because they do threaten our way of life. Mm-hmm. They can threaten our physical life because certainly partners are in danger of contracting diseases. It's threatening in terms of financial safety and stability. It's the whole safety and stability of the relationship. I think the betrayal trauma attacks safety on every single level, whereas, say, a trauma related to a car accident affects us maybe physically and we have an initial emotional response, but it's not been someone we trusted violating us. So that's what makes this trauma, I think, much deeper and much more difficult to heal from, because it's a relational trauma. Yeah. We had an expectation of safety.
So right. How do you determine the difference between codependent and trauma victims? We talked yesterday about the addiction model of treating spouses and why that's not necessarily effective. But a lot of these spouses have been labeled as codependent or co-addicts when they've gone for help. And could you please explain to us the difference between a codependent and a trauma victim?
Well, I'm going to give you Barb's view. Barb's view is that codependency is a way, or codependent is a way of describing trauma responses.
Okay.
I think of someone we might label as codependent as behaving in ways that they learn to behave to survive a crazy, usually traumatic situation. So think of a kid growing up in a chaotic home, full of that relational trauma that happens when a child's not safe. And they learn to adapt and survive by demonstrating certain behaviors. So they may try to make peace all the time. It's a survival technique that they learn. And so we take that set of behaviors and then we pathologize it and say, okay, now you have this disease of codependency. When, I'm sorry, it was a learned behavior, a way of adapting. So for me, I don't even use that word. I understand it can be very helpful for some. It's a way of summarizing the behaviors they see themselves doing that are not helpful to them. I just don't use it. I see them having the same origin, and that's in being unsafe in a situation where you should be safe and you're trying to find safety. The motivation is the same, trying to find safety. But when I ask partners if they're concerned that maybe they are codependent or demonstrating codependent behaviors, I ask them for the things that you're doing to try to find safety or to engage with another person. Are you doing that to try to find safety in your environment, or are you doing it to really try to control another person because you think that, you need to be in control? And most partners would say, it's not codependent. I'm not trying to enable. I'm not trying to take care of because that's how I get my worth. But it's more, I'm trying to set an environment where I can be safe. And the only way I can think of doing it is making sure he behaves or that he does what he's supposed to do. He goes to treatment and all that. And the motivation is because I don't want this ever to happen to me again. Yeah. So it's self-protective behaviors. But it doesn't work in the long run. And so what we do is then try to find things that do help her promote a sense of safety for herself.
Okay.
Is that clear?
Yeah, I think that's very
clear. To
me,
I don't see a lot of benefit in using the word codependent because, again, I think it's, and I do think it pathologizes women, and I'm getting pretty tired of pathologizing women and their responses to being victimized. I don't like doing that.
I totally agree, and that's one of the reasons I'm so delighted to be talking to you. A lot of times people go to a 12-step program because in the past that's really been pretty much what was available for them, to try. They go to Al-Anon or they go to, I hate to use the word codependents of sex addicts. And there are some strengths in the 12-step model to help people through all of this. But my own experience was it tends to reinforce the feeling of powerlessness that you have over the situation. And would you please explain to us how your model of treating trauma victims is different, and why you believe it's important to reframe a partner's reaction as trauma?
Okay. Well, I agree with you that for a lot of partners, 12-step has been the only thing that's been available to them, and a lot of them have really found help and support. For me, that's the primary benefit of going to a group like that, is the support. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that more. But it can reinforce this idea of I am helpless, powerless to do anything about what's happening to me. And when you look at what's happening to a partner from a more mental health perspective, and that's more of a trauma model kind of perspective, we know that for trauma survivors, what they need immediately is a sense of control again over things that they can control, that they need to feel empowered. They need to know that they have a say to what's happening to them. Someone's traumatized when they feel totally out of control to do anything about what's happening to them. So we want to help empower them just as soon as possible to take action and to feel empowered and to promote safety for themselves. So empowerment, boundaries, taking action, making decisions as soon as possible. That's how you treat a trauma survivor. You provide support. You don't tell them they're powerless. You say, where are you powerful? Where do you still have control? How can you create safety in your situation again? So it's very different.
Yeah.
And I find that it's much more hope-giving for a partner than to be told, you're powerless. He's probably going to continue to relapse and act out the rest of his life. So you're just going to have to find a way to be at peace with this in yourself, because there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm saying, yes, there is. There are absolutely things you can do and have a say about what you will and will not allow into your life. That's empowering.
Yeah, that's very empowering. And I think it also validates the partner's pain. So they realize, hey, there's a reason why I feel like this, and it's okay that I feel like this.
And it's absolutely predictable that you would feel like this.
Yes.
This is what trauma survivors do.
Yes. Yes.
They have these responses, again, because it's physiological as much as it is emotional or relational.
And when you're talking about that too, I think the other piece here that's important is it places the responsibility for the sexual addiction on the addict and not on the partner,
Right.
Which has been a huge part of how our own sense of ourselves has been really dismantled by the addiction model.
Yeah.
So, and then, as you said, it provides a diagnostic understanding for partners who have learned helplessness as a result of all of this.
Right.
So, I want to talk a little bit about a call that I got from one of my readers of an affair of the mind. I got a lot of calls, letters, emails, and so forth. But this one, Barb, I will never, ever forget this. It's like burned into my mind, and I wept just after I got it. It was a young woman who fell completely apart on the phone, and she had 4 children under the age of 10. Mm-hmm. Her husband had just been selected as Teacher of the Year at the Christian school where he was working, and she had just discovered that he was bisexual and was doing hookups at a rest stop. Mm-hmm. And she couldn't go to her church for help because her husband would lose his job, and how were her children going to eat? And then she felt she couldn't leave him because she had been that Titus II stay-at-home woman, and she didn't think she could get a job that was going to pay her enough to pay for childcare for the children, because I mean, that's going to be a lot of childcare money, and then living expenses too. And this woman felt utterly, utterly helpless, and was spending a lot of time crying with her children, saying, "Mommy, why are you so sad?" And she felt she couldn't tell them, because to do that would be to dismantle their father in their eyes. And so, would you please tell us a little bit more about how a spouse's feelings of powerlessness fuels the trauma that she's going through?
Well, it's that you described it so well just in this story, that there's, from her perspective, no matter where she turns, there is continued danger. So she's entrapped in this situation where financially she's in jeopardy, physically she's in jeopardy, emotionally she's in jeopardy, her support system is in jeopardy. Everything is. If she gets help for herself, it's going to create more pain for her. So she has, it's really a bind for her. And for me, then that's that trap that encases someone like her, where she just continues to be a victim of trauma. So it's a traumatizing environment that just continues until she makes a decision, just like a battered woman. I mean, it is so similar to what it's like for a woman trying to get out of a violent relationship. Mm-hmm. Till she makes the decision and gets enough support to say, I have to get out of this traumatic environment, even though I know it's going to bring its own pain and trauma, to move on and to be able to try to heal. But it just compounds the trauma, that initial trauma of finding out, and then all of those other things that feel so unsafe, and where she feels so silenced and so gagged, it's like someone's put a gag in her mouth, and she's not allowed to speak her truth and her experience.
That's so powerful, Barb, and you write about that in your book. You call it a speechless terror.
Yeah.
And I remember for myself, I literally had times when I could not speak at all. Mm-hmm. And then when I would try to, sometimes just gibberish would come out of my mouth, and I was horrified that it would be like that. But even when I would feel like I wanted to try to express my feelings about all of that. It was really hard for me to name those feelings. I didn't know how to contextualize them. There didn't seem to be words that would actually adequately describe it. And so would you please explain why it's so difficult for spouses to articulate what they're feeling?
Yeah, this speechless terror is a phrase that was coined by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the primary researchers and experts on PTSD. He calls it speechless terror. And again, this is his material and his stuff, and I don't get all this brain stuff, so I'm going to tell you what Bessel says, Dr. Van der Kolk says. So he says that there's this area in the brain called the Broca's area, and that's the part of the brain that helps us put our emotions, our feelings into words. And when it's functioning, it works really well. But trauma impacts that area, kind of freezes it, immobilizes it. And so when those feelings come up, the Broca's area, that place in our brain that helps us put words to it, isn't functioning. Or it's not functioning the way it should. So it is. It's like it's all in there and it has no release. And it's because of something going on in the brain. But it feels crazy, especially for someone who previously could fully, freely express their emotions. It's just frozen.
Wow. And there's like a biochemical thing that's happening here too with the hormones and so forth. And would you speak a little bit to that as this terror continues in people's lives?
Well, we know that when we're under any kind of stress, our hormones fluctuate and there's an increase in certain hormones when we're under stress, and that's the body's way of getting ready, getting ready for the fight, getting ready to run away. So it floods the whole body with these hormones. When you're in a chronic environment where there's chronic high stress or chronic trauma, it's like the body is just in this bath. If you think of being in a soaking tub, and is just bathed in all of these hormones like cortisol. And over time, if there's that high level of those hormones in your body, that can really start to break things down. So it can increase our blood pressure, increase things like insomnia, eating issues. It can bring about depression, depressive kind of symptoms, anxiety. It can suppress our immune system so that we're much more susceptible to diseases. So it's not at all unheard of. You were describing getting pneumonia. That is so common. I see so many women who come in with these really severe infections or chronic pain issues, fibromyalgia, things that maybe they had for years. They didn't know why they were under stress until discovery happened, but their body knew they were under stress. Yeah. And so the effects are there in terms of disease. There's a good book called The Body Remembers, and it talks about the impact of trauma on the body. Highly recommend it because the body knows you're traumatized way before you cognitively know. And so the effects are throughout your body.
Thank you, Barbara. We've really laid in some good groundwork here so that women can understand, and usually it is women. I mean, I know sometimes there are men whose wives are sex addicts and they experience these same traumas, but my personal experience has been it's mostly women. Would that be your experience as well?
Well, my experience is that it's mostly women who reach out for help. I have worked with some male partners, and I will see very similar symptoms in them. A difference I see in a lot of the male partners is they don't have the same pressures to maintain the relationship with an active addict. And a lot of times they just leave, they end the relationship. Or it's like men who are in physically abusive relationships, how hard it is for them to reach out for help because they feel like, well, this shouldn't be happening to me if I'm a strong man. So I do think that there's a greater barrier. As hard as it is for female partners to get help, I think it is harder for male partners to get help because there's just this stigma attached to, his manhood if he has to admit his wife is not being faithful. So I wish more men would come out and get some support and help. I wish they would do that. It would take a lot of courage.
Yes, it would. Thank you, Barbara, would you be willing to come back tomorrow and talk to us about steps that spouses can take to begin to heal from this?
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you so much. This is Laurie Hall, author of An Affair of the Mind and host of the website www.afteranaffairofthemind. Thanking you for being with